Bruce Lowry Chevrolet is celebrating 100 years of family ownership and giving you the best deal on your next vehicle. From the 2022 Chevy Silverado Crew Cab with 1.9% APR for well-qualified buyers, to the 2022 Chevy Equinox with 0% APR or $1,000 cash allowance. Come see us at 711 Southwest Loop 820 in Fort Worth or visit BruceLowryChevrolet.com. Bruce Lowry Chevrolet. Find new roads.
So last Thursday, we had a pretty big storm come through our area and brought some much-needed rain that unfortunately doesn't appear to really have done a whole lot to help our drought conditions, but it did bring some severe weather to Ellis County, and here is that storm. So this is as it had moved through Ferris and was continuing on through the county, and this storm was pretty impressive in terms of in some places the hail, really especially the wind that it produced. And I wanted to talk a little bit about something that occurred with all of this activity that to me was really interesting, and I think that you might find interesting as well. So this is the storm that we see, and what I want to do is carry this forward kind of a little bit step by step here. So as it moves forward, what you see is it starts to kind of straighten out, and there's little sections that are kind of bowing out too. And of course here you have a little bit of an outflow boundary pushing out of that as well. And it continues forward, and here's something that we see. First of all, you notice this bowing out. So this kind of sticking out, is bulging out here, and this was one of the areas where we got some very strong winds. Very strong winds pushing into Waxahachie there. And as this continues, you also notice that the precipitation appears to pick up as well. And then again, in the Oakleaf area, it kind of does the same thing, starts to kind of bow out there. And as this continues on, again, another push of very strong winds and another kind of in the Midlothian area. And you notice again that the precipitation really picks up here. So what you can imagine here is with the precipitation picking up and the winds picking up, there must be some motion down as you're thinking about the precipitation picking up, and then out as you think about the winds pushing forward out of this. So let's continue on, and we'll zoom out again a little bit. And again, as this continues, you see, really in this frame here, you see some strong winds pushing out this way, strong winds that way, and then kind of up in the top as well. So you can see distinct areas where the storm is pushing kind of outward. And these were some areas right here in kind of the Forreston, Five Points area, over here south of Midlothian and then north of Midlothian as well, particular areas that reported some strong winds. And then what you start to see here over the next few frames is a couple of things happening. One, this activity starts to become much less organized, and you see that the outflow boundary is creating new activity over towards the Cleburne area. And as it goes on, this stuff really starts to fall apart in this area, and then it continues on ahead of this activity with that outflow boundary. And then it continues on, and again, you see this is really starting to fall apart, lose its intensity, and then by the end of this, it's kind of unrecognizable. But again, more activity developed ahead of it in the Johnson County area. So what exactly happened here? Let's kind of back up a little bit, and I want to show you a couple of things that were happening. So for one, you know that I use the high-res velocity to tell you wind speeds, wind direction, and of course this is how we pick up, a lot of the time, this is how we pick up on very gusty winds and rotation and those kinds of things. There's a couple of things that happen here. One, you notice there's kind of this gap here, and I'm really not sure what caused this gap, but this really presented an issue. It made it hard for me to see exactly what was going on with these storms. I can generally tell here that, there's some stronger winds on the leading edge of this, but really this gap made it difficult to see exactly what was going on. And you can see the gap persists right ahead of that storm. And again, I can see some brighter greens, but I'm not getting a clear picture, and it's hard to tell what's accurate and what's not. So a few things that happened. For one, the first thing that we notice, and this is something that I noticed afterwards, right around Rager Springs, there seems to be this red blob that kind of sticks out. But again, this is right on the edge, or possibly even part of this gap that we were seeing in the velocity radar view. radar's not perfect, things happen. So that's what we were looking at there, and this appears to have been, as that goes forward, this appears to have been one of these spikes in wind direction, in wind speed, and those very strong winds that turned out to be destructive. But this continues on, and it gets a little bit better as it gets south of Waxahachie, but again, heading out towards the Boz 5 Points area, here's another one of these spikes, and I know that was one area that had some strong winds. Again, here it is. So there's kind of another spike in this. And really what was interesting here is that, again, still kind of some issues with the gap. It's not the clearest, but you see strong winds here, but you see a different color here. And this is kind of where we start to see sometimes that very broad rotation. And there were rumors, as there usually are, that there could have been some tornado damage and possibly tornadoes involved here. That really wasn't a factor. Tornadoes were not kind of a factor in this day, but again, there was the potential just ever so briefly. I mean, you see how quickly that dissipates here, of possibly some very broad rotation, but nothing really to be concerned about. And then you can see here another kind of spike of some stronger winds right around the Griffith area, that bright green there. But then you notice that, again, it becomes less organized. And, again, it's kind of hard to tell because of the gap in the issue that we were seeing with the radar. So that made it very hard for me to see. And you see another one here right around Lillian, between Lillian and Burleson there, and going on from there. The other thing I want to show you, and this is really the telltale, and, we were looking back at this, kind of doing some research on the storms themselves, and I didn't even think about this. About this aspect of it, but my moderator Matt actually reminded me, hey, we need to check that. So this is the echo tops. This is the top of the storm. This tells us how high these storms are, and you can see right around here as it's over Lancaster and Pecan Hill, the Ferris area. Those are very high up echo tops, right? Very tall storm. Here's the difference. As I move this over, you can see again very tall storm. As it moves forward and we start to get into these periods where we started seeing these very strong winds develop, watch what happens, okay? Very high up storm, and again, here's kind of one of those gaps there that kind of made it hard to see some. You start to see it. We're not seeing the reds that we were seeing, especially up north. So what happened, and I know that Ovilla, Oakleaf, that area saw some stronger winds. So what happened was we started to see the clouds drop a little bit. And especially if we zoom in here over the next few frames, look at this. Look at the difference here. And look at the way that we're losing color very quickly here. And again, we have kind of a swell, and then it drops out again. And then it flattens out and drops out again. So what's happening here, and what we've correlated, is that over time, as this is going on, we'll go back to the beginning here, as this is happening, we are seeing the precipitation get heavier. So the downward motion, the downdraft of the storm, remember we have an updraft and a downdraft. The updraft is weakening, so it's not pushing the hail and the wind up in the storm as much. Now it's time for everything to come down, right? So it comes down, but with gravity, you will not only have the hail and the rain, that cold air is going to sink as well. Cold air sinks, and it's going to do that, and sometimes it does it at a pretty impressive pace. That's called a downburst. Or if it's a smaller area, it's a microburst. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between the two. But what can happen is the core of the storm, okay, the core of the storm is where you have the hail and the heaviest rain. It's up in the storm. It's where that cold air has formed. That's where you get your hail and all those different elements. That's going to come down. That's part of a storm, the core collapsing. Well, all of that downward motion, it's going to go down. When it hits the ground, what's it going to do? It's going to spread out. So what happened was we had a few spots, especially south of Waxahachie and onto the Boz area, and again over in the Ovilla, Oakleaf area, or excuse me, Oakleaf, not Oakleaf, Oakleaf. We saw those very strong winds, and those eventually move out ahead of the storm. You get the outflow boundary, of course. And sometimes you'll get those winds before you even get any rain once they've moved out from the base of the storm. So, what happened? The core of the storm fell out, the downdraft strengthened, and that all that sunk hit the ground, spread out. And that's why it can seem very sudden at times. That's why people sometimes think it's a tornado, because it's just a sudden rush of very strong winds. And sometimes when they spread out like that, it can be very sudden and very damaging, but it's not always a tornado. I think the assumption a lot of the time is that people think, well, this is a tornado, this has to be a tornado situation because I see wind damage, but straight line winds should not be underestimated. They can really make a huge difference in terms of a storm. So let's get away from radar. We've shown you everything I can here. Let's actually take a look at what a downdraft looks like in a storm. So you look at this, you look how quickly that just falls out of that storm. And this is where you can actually see the updraft there too. But look at this, look how fast it just seems to fall. That's called a wet downdraft, or a wet downburst, or a wet microburst. Just falls, it's just like a bomb of, in fact, a rain bomb is one of the things you'll see with some of the more dramatic events. But you see how quickly that drops out of the storm, and you can see it kind of, you see that? Watch very closely. You can actually see where it drops out, and then it kind of spreads out. You see that little element there? It came in and dropped out. And sometimes it's going to drop and it's going to bounce, and the updraft will catch it. That's where you get some of these scud clouds that develop here. Let's go to another one of these, and we'll take a look at that as well if I can get that to play. This is really interesting. See how it's pushing, it's spreading out. It's spreading out there. So what happens is you have the rain that drops, but then you're going to see, if I can get that to, let's see, I thought that was going to loop. Let me play that one more time here. And you see the way it pushes out? That's where it's hitting the ground and spreading outward. So what's going to happen, and eventually, most likely, that was a very direct downdraft part of that of that storm. Let's see if maybe I can get that to just go piece by piece here. So what you have is you have it pretty straight down to the ground, but you notice you're starting to get kind of a push outward there. And as it continues on, there you can see it's starting to push outward. So that's where those winds are pushing the rain down, and it goes outward like this. And you can see it's very thick, and you can almost see through it here, so it's not as heavy right in this area. It's probably a microburst. Looks like it's a pretty small area that is covering. And it continues on, and you can see where it's pushed outward, right? So here's the rain shaft, but it's pushing so far out from that it's going out across the ground. It's like if you got a bucket of water, poured it out, it's going to hit the ground and spread in all directions, right? It doesn't go through the ground. It's got to go somewhere, so it goes outward. And that is what we're seeing with this particular situation. And you can see it kind of still doing that a little bit, right? You can still see kind of this outward push, but it's kind of a short-lived thing in this example. Again, probably a microburst, and you can even see in this where it's dropping down, and that's the sun going down as well. But even on the back side of this, just briefly, see if I can get back to that frame. Even on the back side of it, you can kind of see where it's pushing outward this way as well. So that is a downburst, a microburst, that kind of thing, and that is what we saw in those storms. Now, let me say one more thing. I've talked about gustnados before, or those little brief spin-ups on the leading edge of a storm in where the wind is really strong. It's not absolutely out of the question that we could have seen that. In fact, there was a point where we saw a few clouds from someone that sent in a message. I'm going to see if I can cue that up now. They sent a message in, and they received, or they saw rather, some clouds. They were in South Waxahachie looking east, and it almost looks like this could have been a part of what we saw from that Rager Springs area. And they saw a bit of a lowering in the clouds. Not every lowering is a tornado. Let me make sure you understand that. Not every lowering that you see out there is tornadic, but you can at times see those lowerings that occur And, sometimes that's just going to be part of what you'll see involved in some of this activity. So let me see if I can zoom in on some of this. I don't know if I'm going to be able to or not. Let me see if I can get really one of the better pictures up here. Because it really does make a big difference at times what you can actually see from a storm. So let me try to get the best view of this I can. It's kind of grainy. It's a relatively small picture, but you can see a little bit of a lowering there, and it does appear to kind of reach towards the ground. It's kind of angled here. It does appear to reach towards the ground a little bit, and it allows you to see this kind of push downward and reach toward the ground, and it does appear to be kind of a funnel shape. Again, I can't confirm whether or not this could very well be upward moving scud clouds. Without seeing motion, it's very hard to know this. But all this to say, I can't say whether this is a funnel cloud or not. I can't say whether or not this could just be just a lowering that happened with the microburst or something of that nature. But if one of these little spin-ups did happen, sometimes usually they're very brief, they're small, and very hard to catch on radar. There was one that happened in Rockwall recently where radar didn't catch it. There was no warning issued. It was very hard to catch it on radar because sometimes they can even happen between radar sweeps. The radar sweeps one particular area every 3, 4, 5 minutes at times because it has to cover an entire area and multiple tilts, multiple elevations. So, these very brief spin-up tornadoes that sometimes they happen and they're gone. It's just they're that fast. They're not the kind of tornado that we see that travels miles and miles. These are very different animals. So it's not out of the question, but the evidence we've seen suggests that we're looking at this kind of thing. Just downward motion, downward moving air, very powerful column of air that hits the ground, spreads out in all directions, and causes some damage because it's a very quick push of air. The last thing I'll mention, too, is we are experiencing drought conditions. That means that trees are generally going to be weaker. They haven't gotten the water that they usually do. The ground is much weaker as well. It's not structurally sound. So things that might have been anchored down or some of those poles or the tree limbs and those kind of things, the drought conditions we've seen made those things a little bit more vulnerable than they otherwise might have been. So that could be a factor as well in how much damage we actually saw. It's hard to say exactly for sure, but I can tell you that the storms that we have seen in the spring when we have more rain, there's sometimes not quite as much damage from this kind of thing as we saw just this past Thursday. So I hope this clarifies some things for you. I know that there's going to be some skeptics out there who are just convinced that they saw a tornado, but I hope this clarifies some of what we saw, and hopefully you learned something about storms that happen. And a lot of the time in the summer, we get these gusty storms. That's why I talk about sometimes those severe thunderstorm warnings are issued specifically for the winds that we could see come out of those. And sometimes they happen very quickly. So it can seem like a very light rain going on, and then it just picks up all of a sudden, and it's just an instant monsoon. That's probably what we're looking at. Again, cool air, the cool core of the storm, pushes down, spreads out across the ground, and then that storm starts to fall apart because the core of that storm, the cool air in that storm has fallen out and it starts to die away. That storm, sometimes that's why we see alpha boundaries before a storm starts to die out. So thank you so much for watching. If you have any questions or concerns or input on this at all, please put that in the comments if I can talk here. Put that in the comments there. I would love to hear from you. And make sure you tune in to future Wild Weather Wednesday segments. I've got some things coming up that I think you might enjoy. Until next time, stay safe and stay cool.